context. Gareth, off you go.
So thanks, Paul. Good afternoon, everyone. Great to see such a huge level of interest in the event. I'm just going to give a brief overview of the document that was referenced at the start of the discussions, which we led the development of. To be honest, most of the challenges have been far more eloquently set out by the combination of George and AJ in their preceding calls. But I guess the point really is that the Minister in his opening remarks noted the journey towards net zero that Scotland as a whole is on. And then we've seen how the aspects of that play out locally on Islay, both from a community perspective and the complex investment decisions that are made by distillers and others businesses on the island. And I suppose that adds to the idea of this energy system and thinking about it holistically so that everyone can benefit in that journey. And this is really what I'll touch on in the following slides. So next slide, please. So we've heard already, if we break the energy system down into power, heat, and transport, that there are significant challenges in play at present. So George noted specifically around the issues of disruption to supply and the time taken to maintain, particularly the subsea cables that are bringing power to the island, and the issues of the constraint to bringing in any other onshore capacity at the present time. So looking to extend, maybe to have a second community wind turbine or some of the other options that AJ noted in his discussions. From a heat perspective, we know that fuel oil, and we saw from the opening notes how significant the amount of fuel oil being imported currently to the island is. And that has a knock-on effect in transport as well, in terms of the amount of movement of vehicles bringing those deliveries to the individual distillers and others, and the need to take up berths on ferries bringing vehicles to the island to enable petrol and diesel supplies for vehicles on the island. And again, thinking about this whole system approach, as we note with the move to electric vehicles, you would need some additional electrical capacity, which again, as we note, is difficult to achieve in the current situation. Next slide, please. So if we just elaborate briefly on each of those theories. So in terms of power, we can't at present expand any significant amount of community or business-owned renewable energy generation without significant costs of upgrading parts of the network, and that makes the economics of those difficult. And as AJ noted, the current situation with subsidies also doesn't necessarily favour some of the technologies we'd be most likely to try and bring on board. And as George mentioned as well, diesel fuel generators continue to be needed on the island to maintain power flows and balance during shortfalls and outages. Next slide, please. From a heat perspective, you saw the range of opportunities that AJ was looking at specifically at Bruichladdich. And if we aren't able to provide additional significant amounts of electricity, again, as George mentioned in his talk, then the options you have for decarbonisation are limited and make it much harder to avoid some of the fuel substitution questions that AJ brought up in terms of using alternatives which still require significant infrastructure, both on the island and continued import of substantial volumes. There's no single solution and source of supply on the island that can meet both existing and future demand. So we need to try and use as many of the opportunities as we can and ensure that we don't come to a position where we're simply displacing, for example, fuel oil with huge volumes of biomass that we're bringing into the island. But the point that's been made throughout the previous speakers is that everyone has a commitment to continue this journey towards net zero and reduce the carbon impact of energy and transport requirements on the island. Next slide, please. So again, from a transport point of view, we've mentioned about the infrastructure implications, and particularly the impact on the local road network from the vehicles that are moving around, often providing the fuel deliveries. And without significant increase, again, coming back to this link and the whole system approach, without the ability to have more power to offer perhaps something like hydrogen generation, then the alternatives fuels for both ferry or air transport, as well as larger vehicles, is very limited. Next slide, please. So if we think forward and think about a future energy system, then we're really beginning to think around some of the challenges that both speakers have spoken around. And what is it that we want to try and achieve? Well, certainly sustaining the energy supply, maximizing use of local resources, and reducing the scale of import would be an important consideration. Where we can, and we'd look to reduce energy costs, but also avoid some of the built-in costs around a continued reliance on fossil fuels. You've seen all of the major oil companies significantly shifting position in their strategies moving forward, and that's likely to mean a pressure on those costs of those fuels moving forward. We mentioned, of course, about security of supply and also the ability to cater for increased demand. We're seeing continued growth in the distilling capacity, but also in visitors to the island, and all of those need to be accommodated. Next slide, please. So in terms of what that might mean in the future, well, we've talked about offshore and the opportunities that tidal and offshore wind could provide. The Minister mentioned about Orkney and the network management and the smarter management of power, and that also plays into some of the opportunities that might come up through local energy supply company ideas that George articulated. If we're able to land the offshore power, then that certainly provides the opportunity to open up capacity for more onshore generation as well. And again, we need to be able to store some of that energy, and that through a battery storage mechanism could mean that we move away from the reliance on diesel generators. And again, we mentioned previously about the opportunity for hydrogen production if we have sufficient power to fire electrolyzers. Next slide, please. From a heat point of view, again, we're linking into the electrification possibility. So that provides more options for where we can go. So heat pumps are one option that immediately become more available if we have more power to support that, as well as other forms of heating. It also opens up the possibility of production of hydrogen, and that can be used as a heating fuel or an energy store for power generation. But equally could be a longer term solution for both ferries, large vehicles, and potentially the aircraft coming to Islay. And that really talks to the net export opportunity that the Minister alluded to as an aspiration in the longer term. Next slide, please. Again, from a transport point of view, opening up the power gives us the chance to think about electrification of smaller vehicles and, as I mentioned before, the hydrogen fuel and fuel hybrid larger vehicles and potentially aircrafts and ferries. Next slide, please. Oh, we seem to be going backwards. Thank you. So just to finish on then, it's to re-emphasize, and it was something that we tried to articulate in the scenarios that are in the report, is that a whole system approach is really crucial here. There's no single alternative which will deliver the benefits across the heat, power and transport needs of everyone in the community. Those needs are interlinked, and that therefore the opportunity to think around those and the chance to think about the potential investment opportunities from the rural growth deal and cascading that as a catalyst for work across the community is certainly the most efficient way of meeting future energy needs and continuing the net zero journey. So thank you for that. I'll hand back to Paul.
Oh, thanks, Gareth. Thank you very much. There's just a couple of points I wanted to raise before we move on to Ross's explanation of the workshops. We talked right at the start of this process about the fuel poverty and the cost of fuel on Ireland, the obvious cost because of the importation transportation. If there was a renewable source from wind or tidal, and then there was a grid, as George had discussed, would that make the cost of power, give it parity with the mainland?
It would certainly contribute. It's hard to say, as we've noted previously, the regulatory position is quite complex, but there are certainly benefits from that, not least in terms of the investment which then is localized in the network on Islay, rather than to some extent competing with investment on the mainland and the reliance on that to open up capacity, which is a more costly option. So certainly that, and there are ongoing parts of the regulatory piece which may well support that, certainly in terms of the role of the DNOs and potential requirements that may be put on them in their operating license moving into the later 2020s.
But for all the complexity and the regulatory issues and all those matters, is essentially a tidal wind renewable source with a new grid on Islay the real panacea that ultimately will be the best, cheapest, sensible operation for Islay as a whole? Notwithstanding there may be other technologies that come in the short term and do those sorts of things.
As I mentioned, the need is really to open up all the possibilities. AJ, in his presentation, showed the raft of options that Bruichladdich had looked at themselves. And if you consider that at an island level, without that additional power capacity, the options really are limited, and the pressure on the costs associated with those fossil fuels will continue to rise. So certainly the unlocking the power availability is a critical aspect of delivering sustainable and affordable power for the island going forward.
Can you demystify from me slightly? It might not be for other people. If so, I apologise. About hydrogen. And hydrogen, I think you mentioned, needs power. So what do you think the long-term benefits of hydrogen are? I think that George mentioned that commercial vehicles will struggle to work on an electric basis when need hydrogen. Is that technology a long way away? Not